that are available to you to understand that impact. I'm really pleased to have my colleague here today, Ryan Stubbs. He is the Senior Research Director for NASA. And before you get all confused, by NASA, we do not mean the space agency, even though we do often go where no one has gone before. NASA is the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies, and we're pleased to have Ryan here because he has really sound expertise in public funding for the arts and state policy and the creative economy. And he also serves as NASA's primary research liaison to many federal agencies and foundations and consultants and scholars regarding support for the arts. So we're very pleased to have Ryan here today. You might have seen on the invitation that we also invited Lisa Franklin Robinson, who's president of the North Braddock City Council. Fortunately, she's ill today. So we will proceed and wish her a speedy recovery. We will still talk a bit about how this conversation and these data play out in the conversations that you might have in your community. Like so many performing arts organizations, we're going to go on with the show because this is live theater. I also want to give a special shout out to Nora Johnson, who is the PCA's Director of External Affairs and Public Awareness. She did a really good job putting together this session and really raising this as an opportunity for us to share data and tools for all of you. So thank you, Nora. Before we get much further in the conversation, I do want to say something about the arts and the many benefits of the arts. We definitely see that there are numerous instrumental and intrinsic benefits for the arts. So while we are talking creative impact or creative economy impact today, we recognize that the arts are really a huge part of our culture, of our education, in addition to our economy. And increasingly, the PCA is highlighting the connection between the arts, or what we often call the creative sector, and community and economic development. In particular, quality of place is becoming increasingly important, especially in Pennsylvania. And place is important because it is now a primary driver of decisions that people make about where they want to live, where they want to work, where they want to invest, and where they want to visit. And obviously, what we do, what the arts do, are fundamental to quality of place. And this is having a big ripple effect, not just at the PCA in terms of how we're trying to support communities, but it really is part of an expanding and shifting set of strategies for both the public and private sector as it focuses on quality of place and investments in quality of place that will make a difference. This is all to say that at the PCA, we really believe that building stronger communities, which is what we want to do, takes creativity. So enough of that. As I mentioned, we are talking economic impact numbers today. And I want to say that we called this session, Do You Know Your Numbers? And why is it important to know our numbers? And it's do you know your numbers is kind of a phrase that we borrowed from kind of the health field, and it's important for everyone to know their key numbers, and that gives them an indication of things they need to be aware of, where they are in that health scale. People often say, do you know your numbers when you're looking at your home finances or your business finances or your organization finances? So it's very important for us to know creative sector numbers. It lets us know how we're doing, how we compare to others, and what are key trends that can help us with our strategies and our decisions going forward. So this is an opportunity to do that. And finally, when I talk about the creative sector, we really think inclusively about all that participate in the creative sector. And it is broad and it is big, and you're going to be hearing more about that as we go through our conversation. But we see the creative sector as being composed of both private and public actors, the for-profit and nonprofit sector, W-2 employees, gig workers, volunteers, etc. All that goes together to make the dynamic creative sector that we have in our country and indeed in Pennsylvania. So as we go through this, you'll be seeing, I think, an inclusive look at what we are talking about in the creative sector. So with that, again, I'm really pleased to have Ryan here. Ryan, thank you. I'm going to kick it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Karl. Appreciate that introduction and that context. So again, I'm Ryan Stubbs. I'm the Senior Director of Research with the National Assembly of State Arts Agencies. And yes, my joke, I guess, is that we're not the space agency, but we are out of this world. And NASA is the association for the nation's 56 state arts agencies, including every state, DC, the Pacific Island territories, Puerto Rico, and Virgin Islands. And we do our work really in a number of ways. One is through representation and advocating for the arts at the federal level. Another is through building communities. So having state arts agencies across the country learn from each other through convening and webinars and things like this. And my job is really the knowledge services part of our work. So a lot of that is about understanding all of the amazing work that state arts agencies, including the Pennsylvania Council for the Arts, are doing, and how they're funded, where grants are going, size of awards. And another thing that I think is important and that I have some expertise in is understanding how different states measure their creative economies. So that's what we'll be focusing on today. And during the presentation, I want to discuss some background and considerations when measuring and talking about the creative economy, because it is complex and there's many ways to think about it. And then I'm going to be running through a number of web pages and a number of resources to help build that understanding. And then we'll dig into some of the Pennsylvania specific data and resources that we have. So hopefully through the course of this presentation, you'll be seeing a lot of links and a lot of resources I know there will be a follow-up email that will provide those links. And I think you'll also just be able to kind of pick up and hopefully get a better understanding of where to go to find some of these data and find some of these resources, because there's a lot out there, and it takes some understanding. So I will go ahead and share my screen here to make sure I do it right here. All right. So let me do that. And if that isn't working, please let me know, Karl or Nora. Let me just extend this a little bit so we can see a little bit better. So here first, we just have the NASA website. And this is maybe a little hard to see here, but if you go under our research page, a lot of our resources will be in this creative economy section. And so I would say at the top here, we have some essential creative economy data. These are resources that I'll go into a little bit, or I'll go into a little more detail about some of these resources, but just as a good starting place, this is a good place to get to some of these data. So one thing that I want to talk about is just the long history of agencies, organizations, including state arts agencies, measuring and reporting about the economic value of the arts. So it is nothing new for states and others to report and study the economic value of the arts. And one resource that we have here is a database of state creative economy studies. And so this database draws on 149 studies from 48 states. So it's very common for states to look at the economic dimensions of the arts and to report and communicate about these things. This, just if you're interested in seeing the many ways that states have done this over time, this is a good resource to do so. But I think the point here is that there's no really one correct way of understanding the economic dimensions of the arts because there's many different cultures and differing values for what may encapsulate the creative economy. Another resource that is here that speaks to this is this FAQ that kind of talks about this issue, how there's no one definition of the creative economy, and there's different concepts and nuances. So sometimes we hear phrases like the creative economy, phrases like creative industries or cultural industries, and all of these generally mean the same thing, though there are some distinct concepts that come up within different ways of looking at the creative sector at large. So this is one way of thinking about it. And there's also important context to think to discuss, and that can come up when measuring the creative economy. So lots of dimensions and different ways to look at it. For example, some studies will only look at the for-profit sector versus the nonprofit sector. Actually, it's much more common for studies to look at only the nonprofit sector. But you have more studies that are looking at both the for-profit and the nonprofit. There's other considerations like the level of geographic detail that you want to look at. A big consideration are the data resources from which you can draw on. A huge issue is which industries to include and why. So there's lots of considerations here, and it is very valid, I would say, for any local economy, state, or even organizations to take specific factors into control or into consideration when designing reports or studies. And some of that can be based on what data is available at the local level and what may be priorities for a particular community. So I'd say that just as a context setter, that is all valid. However, there are federal agencies whose job is to measure the value of economic production across the United States. And so, fortunately, the National Endowment for the Arts and the Bureau of Economic Analysis have created the Arts and Cultural Production Satellite Account. And so this is an account that's produced by the US Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is the federal agency that's within the Department of Commerce, and they're responsible for estimating gross domestic product. So it's and on one hand, it's important because it's coming from the federal agency that actually does measure GDP and holds those accounts. And so, what is one thing that's significant about this particular work, and what I think is really valuable about it, is that you're able to uh, precisely define arts and cultural production across industries. So, for example, this satellite account would only include the percentage of software publishing that's related to the creative side of it, such as computer design, arts related software. Another example is that, for example, jewelry manufacturing is in here, but it's restricted to the artistic contribution and not commercial costume jewelry, for example. So This, because it's a partnership with the BEA, it allows us, I think, to measure the full scope of the creative industries and cultural production in the United States. And that's to say what can be measured. So I think we also have to consider that there are many aspects of arts and culture that may not show up in an economic way, but given the economic data that exists and how it's collected, this is a very inclusive way of looking at the total value of arts and cultural production in the United States. Another thing that is really valuable here, and we have to thank our colleagues at the NEA for doing so, is that there are state level data. Um, there are only a handful of satellite accounts produced by the BEA, and even fewer of those have state level data. So this is a really great resource that's not available for all industries, but it gives us some really significant findings about the total value of arts and culture in the United States and at the state level. Unfortunately, it does not drill down beyond the state level. This only captures data at the state level, and we'll go through the data for Pennsylvania and some of the total findings. But fortunately, there are other resources to look at these things, and I think that is one thing that Karl has shared with you via the CV Suite data. So again, we're going to be looking at sort of a national scope and a state level scope, and going through some of the data for Pennsylvania. So one place that I think is really useful to look at is the actual site for the BEA. So again, if you're communicating about these data, there's lots of reports that come from arts organizations or arts advocacy organizations, such as mine or other institutions. But these data are coming from the US Department of Commerce and the BEA. So there is some weight and credibility um, that lends itself to these data. Um, and I think a thing that is really significant here, it's been measured for quite some time. This production account actually became available around 2016, but the data goes all the way back to 2001, I believe. So there's a long time series of data, so we can see how things have changed over time. One thing that is really significant to that, especially in the latest round of data, which encapsulates 2021, is how the arts rebounded and how the economy rebounded from the pandemic. So, of course, that story is ongoing from 2001 to 2002 to the current time, but because we have 2020 data, which was really the most significant part of the pandemic in terms of its effect on the economy. And we see how that changes from 2020 to 2000 to 21. And so that's interesting. And one thing that you can see here, hopefully, this is kind of in the background, is just how that rebounded. We see that the arts and culture sector, as we all know, was devastated, and we know this was especially devastating for the performing arts. But we also know that there's other aspects of the creative economy, such as digital media and web publishing industries, that didn't fare as bad. But we also see that the rebound in arts and cultural production, in terms of the percentage change over year over year, really came back strong for arts and culture in terms of the overall economic impact. But this doesn't fully tell the story of what the ongoing problems are for many performing arts organizations, many of the organizations that we know are still struggling to have audiences come back. So there's always context within the data that we should be careful about. Um, so another thing just to notice here is just the size of the sector, and it's over $1 trillion, right? So the contribution of arts and cultural production to the United States economy in 2001, after coming back, is the largest that it's been measured in the history of the satellite account, and it's over $1 trillion, and it's over um, or it's around 4.4% of total gross domestic product. So that is huge. And as we go into some of the comparison, we do have some data looking at how that compares to other industries, and I'll get to that in a second. But I just wanted to point out a few other ways that you can use this this site and the arts and culture section of the BEA site. So, we'll send the links, but it's fairly easy to find. Actually, how I usually find it is just Google BEA Arts and Culture production account, and it will come up. So there's not only the full data for the country, but there's also state level data. I'll get into some more specifics of a resource that we've created that lets you kind of dig into specific state data. But another resource that I think is really valuable here is that there are summary sheets for every state. So if you go down here to state data, you can find Pennsylvania, and it will bring up a summary sheet. So this will has some of the highlights for the total value added to the Pennsylvania economy, the state share of the value added, the number of jobs, total employment, and the share of employment, along with some of the top industries. So I just, if you need something that's a two-pager that talks about this account and provides some Pennsylvania data and has Bureau of Economic Analysis at the top of it, this is a really useful tool and very easy to access. Now let's go ahead and get into the piece that NASA created. So sorry, I'll go back one click to the NEA site. So again, the NEA site has an overview of the work. There's lots of research and reports. There's a lot of research and explanations of like, how the satellite account was developed. And so if you're interested in those types of things, this is a great resource. And also, this is a great resource just to get to some of these different things that I'm talking about today. So there's a link to the BEA page that I just showed you. There's a link to much more information from the NEA that we just talked about. And also there's this link to the creative economy state profiles that our team at NASA developed. And so the value that I think these state profiles bring is that allows you to drill into some state level data to see some of the trends and done in, I think, a pretty interesting interactive way. So I'm going to go through this tool. First, I'm just going to kind of show how it works and see some of the data from the national level, and then we'll look at some of the Pennsylvania data. So it's fairly straightforward and hopefully intuitive to use. You're able to select a state here at the top, but you're also able to select a state just by clicking on things. So you can click on Pennsylvania. We see the total value added, which is the total dollars contributed to state GDP, is over $28 billion. That's 3.4% of the Pennsylvania economy and over 165,000 jobs. So these are large, impressive numbers that I think are easy to see and easy to understand just from a top line basis. So there's that. We also, have a short paragraph talking about these top line figures. And one thing that I think is useful, because this account does have some economic terms and some technical terms and some things that can be difficult to explain if we get into them too much, but hopefully this also provides an overview of what we mean by these things. So, for example, we're talking about value added, and that's just the total market, the total dollar amount that's contributing to the overall economy, right? So, this again for the United States, arts and culture contribute over $1 trillion to the U.S. economy, which I think is just a great talking point. Um, Another thing that's within the data that we don't talk about a ton, but it's interesting that we can break things out by core industries and supporting cultural production. And there are different figures for those concepts. So, core industries are kind of the originators of ideas and content. So, these would be things like your dance company that's producing a piece of art, your musician that is producing a piece of art, right? So this is kind of the core ideas. But then we know that there's those core ideas, but there's also lots of supporting distributors of art and arts and culture and creativity, such as web publishing and such as broadcasting and ways of distributing the arts. And so those aspects of the economy are a bit larger, but it kind of comes from that creative core. So, which is an interesting concept, not necessarily something that's all that useful to communicate, but something that's in the data. And then another thing that we've done here that I think is also really interesting to talk about is just, okay, how does the total arts and cultural production in the United States compare to some of these other industries? And so here we have some comparison industries. This doesn't include all industries possible, but these are kind of within range of the ACPSA total. But the ACPA total is at this top end of the range, right? One thing, for example, that isn't shown here that would be higher than retail would be healthcare services. Um, but when we look at this in comparison, we see that arts and cultural production, looking across the United States, is actually larger than the construction industry, larger than the transportation industry, and almost on par with retail. So it's very, very significant. There's also different ways to look at this, and it will be different when we look at different components of it. So, value added, again, is that total dollar amount contribution to the economy. Employment would be all wage and salary workers. So, this is one sort of nuanced thing that I think is sort of helpful to explain. Um, so, this account does include the dollar value that is associated with um, independent workers or independent artists, right? Because whatever dollar values are picked up within 1099s and everything that's reported that can be classified as creative industries is going to be in here. Though this won't include the this only includes the wage and salary workers, right? So that the employment numbers, I think, for the arts in these data are probably smaller than, or probably undercounted, right? So I think the total dollar. I guess a simpler way to explain that is just the total dollar figures and the total economic contribution of all those workers are included. However, it's more difficult, I think, to um, include all of the arts workers that are out there. And we also know our sector is complicated, and there's contributions of volunteers and organizations and artists that may not get picked up in any sort of kind of economic reporting. So it's something to consider here, but still very large numbers. Um, and so another interesting thing about the data is that we can explore value added, we can explore employment, and we can explore compensation. So compensation would be the total remuneration for that's payable to employees in a given work year, right? So this includes wages, salaries, and benefits. So essentially, in all of these data, there's these three layers that exist, and there's different stories that you can tell based on what the data say. So there's some comparisons that we have. There's also the ability to look at industries. And what we've done here is to pick or to lift up the top 5 industries. So if we look at the industries across the United States, um, broadcasting is a huge one. So this would be radio, television, and creative broadcasting or cable broadcasting. But another great thing about this particular account is that it can exclude sports or things that may not be relevant to the creative sector. So that's something that this account has and is able to do that not all creative economy studies are able to do based on the data that's out there. So I'll just go through this quickly so we can get into the Pennsylvania data, but we can look at the trends over time. Another thing I think that's interesting here, so things like broadcasting, things like when we look at other information services. So again, some of these names are a little esoteric, but we also have definitions that you can hover over. So other information services would be things like internet publishing and internet broadcasting. So we know that during the between 2020 and 2021, these services increased even during the pandemic. But if we look to, again, these are the top 5 industries, motion
Hey,
picture. Yeah.
Ryan, I'm sorry. Could you zoom out a little bit? I think people can't see your whole screen. So if you could maybe zoom
Okay.
out a smidge,
Okay.
a little more.
Is that better?
I think so. Yeah, I
Okay.
think that's better. Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry about
Sorry.
that. And
No, no, no. Thank you.
all right. So yes, I'm sorry, just kind of getting into some of these trends and how we might expect things to see things through the pandemic and how different industries were affected. There's some interesting things that I think we can pull out here. Another component is looking at how the arts and culture, how arts and cultural production fared relative to the United States economy as a whole is measured by gross domestic product. So another thing that is interesting here, we see obviously the dive in arts and culture value added in 2020, and it was a greater dive than the economy as a whole. But we also see that arts and culture value added bounced back faster than the economy as a whole, 14% in 2021 as opposed to 10% for the economy as a whole. And actually, NASA has produced research, and this is also research that's available and a report that's available on our site that looked at how arts economies and how economies fared coming out of recessions. And so the report was done before we had these data, and it looked at how, coming out of the Great Recession, how did arts economies in different states fare compared to their overall economies? And we did have this finding that the arts and cultural sector did help diversify and accelerate growth in areas that had strong creative sectors. And so, while there's not a separate study that we've done that looks specifically at the rebound from the pandemic, I would say that it is um, we see a similar trend, or we see a correlated trend that the arts sector did bounce back faster than the economy in general. So it's another thing to keep in mind that cultural economies, creative economies can help recover coming out of recessions or times of economic shock. Apologies, I'm going a little bit long here, but I'm getting to the Pennsylvania data. So this is probably what you're all waiting for. And apologies, it's taking this long. But let's talk a little bit more about what we see in the data here for Pennsylvania. So again, we talked about the overall number over $28 billion, 3.4% of the economy. When we look at the value added totals for the arts economy in Pennsylvania compared to other sectors, see, it is a bit lower than construction and transportation, but also nearly on par, right? So again, a very large piece of the overall Pennsylvania economy. We can look at this in terms of employment again. So as we would expect, those numbers decrease a bit, relatively speaking, but still lots of jobs. When we look at the industries in Pennsylvania that are, the top, we can talk about the top 5 industries are shown here. So one thing that we have are location quotients. And just to put it simply, these measure an industry's regional concentration relative to the national share. So this, in some cases, accounts for the population. So, Pennsylvania isn't as large in terms of population for New York, but we can see relatively speaking, what are the creative sectors or specific creative industries that have a strong concentration in Pennsylvania. So these are the, when we take that into consideration, this number, this 2.38, essentially 1 would be the same as the nation, would be the national average. So any number over 1 is higher than the national average. Any number over 2 is much higher than the national average. And so we see industries in Pennsylvania as being particularly strong. One is education services. So this is the provision of arts classes and these are private arts classes in K through 12 and post-secondary. So the provision of arts education is actually very strong in Pennsylvania. Music instrument manufacturing, there's not a description for this industry because it's pretty straightforward. These are musical instrument manufacturers, and you see that you have a particular strength here in Pennsylvania. Rental and leasing, again, this is just kind of where it gets thrown in the overall economic accounts, but that means items that are rented that help with creative industries. So some examples would be theatrical costume rental. Also, we see a large strength in woodwork and custom architectural manufacturing. And this other, so this would be pottery, stained glass, blown glass manufacturing. So essentially the creative aspects of these industries that you're able to get within this account. And we see that these are some of the strengths here in Pennsylvania. We also look at the trends over time. So these are, sort of all over the place, but there are different ways of looking at it. And just to quickly show, if we look at just the actual figures, these industries change. So these industries are very similar to what we see for the nation, right? So these are some of the largest industries, and it's going to be similar across many states. And that's why it's really useful to have the location quotient to see, where there are some particular strengths in different industries. So lots of ways to look at the data. But I think you can get some real insights for Pennsylvania. Again, we see a similar trend. So this is showing Pennsylvania, and we see from 2020 to 2021, the arts and cultural value added increased by 9% for Pennsylvania, while the total gross state product increased by 6%. So again, we see this trend of the arts economy recovering faster than the economy at large. And then we can look at some comparisons. So we always want to compare ourselves to other states. Here, this is again looking at location quotients. So you can think about this, kind of adjusting for population. And so here, District of DC is very high because have a large population in a small area. So I think it's also useful to look at actual figures. So these are some numbers that we might expect, right? New York obviously has an extremely large creative sector, and extremely large population. So we see that. But then within this region, we see Pennsylvania also has, or it has the second largest creative sector when compared to states in the region. And so I guess I've gone through a lot of things here. There's a lot to dig into, and hopefully you'll be able to dig into some of these resources yourself and find insights about, what you know about the state and things that are valuable to talk about in your communities. And it really, I think, all comes down to what you see in your community. There's things that you can know from the data and the overall numbers, and those are impressive and they're important to talk about. But I think it's also important to say, how does this relate to my community? What do I see in my community as being part of the value that the creative sector and creative economy brings? And I think when you can make those ties between your community and what these kind of large overall numbers, that's when you get some powerful messages. So with that, apologies if I went a little long, Karl, but I will hand it back to you and stop sharing.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. I'll do a little housekeeping here. We received some questions in advance of this webinar, which we'll attempt to answer in the time remaining. But if you have additional questions, please feel free to put those in the chat, and we will also try to track those and leave some time to address some of those before closing. So Ryan, thank you very much for providing both a look at tools for the national picture and the Pennsylvania picture. One thing that Ryan had mentioned is that BEA satellite account is very helpful at the national and state level. But I know what you're asking because I was asking the same thing. And Ryan and I have spoken about this in the past, but it's also helpful to have information below the state level. So we are going to provide everyone who attends today information for 67 counties. That's how many counties that we have in Pennsylvania. So you can look at your own county. If you go this way, you can also look at other counties. So I want to preview what our snapshot look for the counties is and what you will be receiving shortly after this meeting. So I'm going to have Nora pull up an example of that. It's from, I think we're going to show Bucks County. And this is the report that we will have available for all 67 counties. These data track very closely with the BEA, not 100%, because there's all kinds of industries and occupations that you can consider when looking at the creative sector, but this tracks very closely. So you're going to get a similar type of look, but here is at the county level. So let's just walk quickly through this snapshot and you'll see what each of you will receive. So at the top level is something that's called the Creative Vitality Index. I want you to think about this very much in line with what Ryan was saying about location quotients. This gives you a way to compare the concentration of culture and arts in a county set against kind of a national average, and it's adjusted for population. And that makes sense. So here in Bucks County, you can see it's at 0.76. The national average will be set at 1. So if you're below 1, your concentration is a little bit below the average. If you're above 1, your concentration is a bit above the average. So here you can see this is a county outside of Philly in the southeast region. It has a 0.76. And you can see what's great about this is it shows changes year over year in a trend line of that kind of concentration of arts activity and the location of it in this county. So you can see a little downtick in 2020. That makes sense, and a little bounce back in 2021, but yet not at the high point. So for each of your counties, you'll get to check kind of this stat for your county or any other county that you want to look at, plus a trend. The next section that you'll see in each of these reports talks about jobs. And this is going to include nonprofit and for-profit, private and public, in industries that are creative or are part creative, and occupations that are the same. So we're really looking at all the ways that creative workers in core industries and support industries are represented in terms of jobs, in this case in Bucks County. And it'll also give you an indication of some of the types of occupations that have the most jobs in this county. You can see that year over year in this example, the number of jobs went up over 2020, which we were very happy to see. Overall, our job number in Pennsylvania did go up. However, it was not evenly spread. I'll give you the headline. Ryan had mentioned issues with performing arts, and indeed, performing arts has not fully recovered in Pennsylvania. The next section looks at the earnings, and this again is for-profit and nonprofit, and it'll show you the earnings in the county for 2021 in this case, and some of the areas that had the top earnings. So again, for each of the counties, you will see that. And finally, there is a breakout for nonprofits. Many of us are interested in nonprofits. The Council on the Arts makes a lot of grants to nonprofits. And you can see that in this case, for this county, nonprofit revenues are down in 2021 a bit in this county. And I will say that that's not unusual. We have seen a bit of this, both in terms of earned and contributed revenue with our nonprofits. There were some early and quite substantial interventions, both at a federal level and a state level, and in some cases local level, that helped nonprofits through what was truly a horrific situation, especially as audiences needed to stay home. We have seen some recovery in demand from audiences, but it's not fully all the way back. We also know that a lot of those special kind of support and recovery interventions are ending. So we'll be very interested in seeing how that plays out as these data go forward. But this is a tool that we'll give to each of you to look at your home county and potentially other counties. And you can use this as a way to, one, understand your own numbers. I think it's important to look at the presence and concentration of the arts in your region and what's happening in these areas. And I wouldn't be too discouraged or too enthused about any of the data that you see here. I think it's just important to know it and then to be able to track it going forward and to have specific conversations. For example, if you would like to see and you think your community or your county would benefit from a higher concentration, a higher CV score, I think that makes sense, especially given what we were talking about earlier. Increasingly, the cultural amenities and quality of life are a differentiator for communities. Place is a driver of retaining your residents, attracting talent, investment, businesses, visitors. So to understand that and to have conversations both at a local level as to how your work plays into place and how that increasingly aligns, I think, with very key community and economic development strategies is a conversation that you can have. That is a conversation as a state agency that we are having at the local levels with community and economic development and local government officials, for example, all across the state. It's a conversation that we're also having with state level officials, both at other state agencies and in the legislature, because frankly, these data are not always known or understood. And in some ways, when you realize how many Pennsylvanians are engaged in the sector, employed by the sector, how many communities are benefiting from it, that is the kind of thing that we're sharing. It might also be helpful for you to share. So as we follow up with this, we will give you the links and the tools that Ryan shared, and they really are quick, and you can have those to use, but you'll also have these county profiles. So with that, and I know we don't have that much time waiting, I wonder if Nora, some questions have come in, or which ones we might have missed.
Yes, so Karl, we have a question that is, how is this information, I think they mean all of it, being presented to members of the General Assembly? What can the arts community do that will further communicate the importance of the arts to our senators and representatives?
Right. I think that's a great question. I can tell you what we're doing and what I think can be helpful. Again, I was mentioning that not everybody has a picture of the arts that is in line with what these data are suggesting in terms of its size and scope. So what we're doing both from an individual level and at community level meetings is sharing the facts and giving them quick kind of one-pagers that give the context with ways for them to dig deeper. The other thing that you can attach to that, which we try to do depending on who we're visiting in, is there are the data, but I think it's good to pair that with a specific story of who we are as the Council on the Arts, but who you are as, likely an arts provider in your community and how you in your story fit in to that data, if that makes sense. So we have found that very easy to read information that can be sent electronically with links for people who want to dig deeper, but making sure you get very strong and clear points on each of these data elements is helpful.
Karl, we have maybe time for like 2 more questions. We have a question about how the creative economy benefits economic sectors like advanced manufacturing and technological innovation.
Right, and Ryan, I'll let you think about that too, as you think about it. From my perspective, one of the things that let's look at manufacturing or tech, is the idea of creativity is increasingly becoming part of the key skill set that is needed to be successful in those industries. And one area that's in the news a lot lately is basically tech-enabled creativity. That's something that's talked about a lot. And I think the pairing of artists and creatives with those tech tools, which, let's give an example of making a more immersive live entertainment experience, art experience, Web3 experience are areas that I think that arts and creativity meshed with those other sectors are going to be, again, competitive advantages and likely be driving growth in those industries over time. But Ryan, do you have a thought on that?
Yeah, I think I would just say the same thing as you did, Carl. First, that we know that creative skills are a skill set that can be measured, or that are measured, and we know that creative skills are in high demand. For example, there's something that we cite from the Future of Jobs report that says creativity, originality, and initiative is the #5 skill set predicted to be in demand for 2025. So I would say employers in all sectors are looking for those types of skills, which I think you can make the argument come from um, arts practices and are related to arts practices. And then, yeah, I would say that as my perception is the further we go, the more intertwined creativity and technology become, right? And it's part and parcel of what we're measuring in the satellite account is the creative production that goes along with technological industries. So I'm thinking things like the gaming industry and things like web publishing and different ways of disseminating creative work to folks. So all those things, I think the sectors learn from each other, and those creative skill sets are really important. Yeah.
Final question. Is there a quick comparison with other sectors in PA or a way to show that comparison?
Yeah, I can take that real quick. So just that is one of the things that is within the creative economy state profile. So when you select Pennsylvania, um, you see that arts and cultural production is, a, a, a couple talking points that I would say is that it's on par with the construction industry in Pennsylvania, and it's on par with transportation industry in Pennsylvania, all around $30 billion annually. So yeah, I think that's an important comparison to make.
Okay. With that, I think we've come to time, and I think we disappear after an hour. But before we go, again, thank you, Ryan, for spending time with us and sharing your expertise and also the tools that NASA has developed. I think they're very easy to use, but also powerful. And again, thank you, Nora, for helping to put this together. And thank you, everybody, for your interest. Like I said, we will be following up with specific access to these tools and your own state access to your own county profile, actually all county profiles. So you'll have that as well. With that, have a great afternoon, and I'm sure we'll be seeing you all soon.